Buckingham Palace had long mastered the art of silence. But when senior courtiers were seen leaving Clarence House in the early hours, whispers turned into roars. Something was wrong, gravely wrong. A sealed medical dossier, locked behind layers of protocol, had shattered the illusion of control. King Charles, Britain's steady but embattled monarch, was no longer the anchor holding the monarchy together, and the palace was preparing for collapse. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began as a flicker, an unusual change in routine, a missed engagement, a car seen leaving Clarence House past midnight. But to those attuned to the rhythms of royal life, every subtle shift is a signal. What they saw wasn't a shuffle, it was a tremor. Rumours swept the halls of Buckingham like a storm. Word had reached senior aides that Condition Swan had been activated, the secret protocol reserved only for a monarch's incapacitation. It wasn't just a medical alert. It was a constitutional alarm bell. Under the highest confidentiality, a private team of royal physicians, those not bound by traditional medical channels, were ushered into Clarence House. Their assessments would never be published, but the results were unmistakable. King Charles had been diagnosed with a progressive, degenerative condition, one that could no longer be disguised under public appearances or stoic silence. Inside the palace, Queen Camilla reportedly erupted in fury. Determined to preserve Charles' image and her own dwindling authority, she is said to have demanded full suppression of the medical documents. But the system had already moved beyond personal wishes. A Crown Phase recalibration memo, marked as Level Alpha, and bearing the crest of the Royal Advisory Council, leaked to 3 separate offices within the cabinet, triggering an immediate cross-communication protocol with the Prime Minister. What the memo laid out was seismic. Within 60 days, transition mechanisms had to be prepared. Not discussed, not proposed, prepared. And then came the most haunting detail. A courier was spotted leaving Balmoral with a velvet-sealed envelope addressed not to the Privy Council, not to Camilla, but to Prince William. Sources close to the Royal Archive confirmed the existence of Charles's handwritten note, penned the night of his diagnosis, and placed within a red leather pouch, reserved only for sovereign-level communiques. No one, not even William, knew its exact contents. But those who had seen the king that night described his demeanour not as fearful, but as final. As palace aides scrambled for damage control, another power quietly stirred from within, not of chaos, but of readiness. While the public fixated on Charles's health, Prince William moved with the precision of a man long trained for an emergency few dared name. A locked dossier marked Ascension envelope was quietly retrieved from Sandringham's inner vault, its contents pointing to an accelerated inheritance plan that stunned even his closest advisors. This wasn't preparation. This was preemption. The Ascension envelope was not merely symbolic. It was the product of years of secret contingency meetings, hidden drafts, and whispered decisions made under the gaze of Queen Elizabeth II herself. Once unsealed, its pages revealed a stark reality. Within 90 days, the crown must be placed on visible standby. Every role, every title, every public appearance was to align with a sovereign-in-waiting model. The Privy Council's copy had already been updated. This wasn't a whisper of succession. It was a strategy of staged dominance. William, though heavy-hearted, activated the first phase, a covert gathering with the Crown Chamber, the same inner circle his grandmother once used during times of geopolitical crisis. Held under the codename Regency Eclipse, the meeting took place within Kensington's inner sanctum, without notice to Clarence House. There, William reviewed logistics with his senior legal advisor, constitutional liaison, and a former aide to Queen Elizabeth, confirming that an unprecedented clause could now be invoked. The Legacy Clarion. The Legacy Clarion had long been rumoured among royal historians, but never officially acknowledged. It was Queen Elizabeth's final safeguard, a document crafted in the wake of her husband's death, granting her heirs the authority to accelerate transitions if stability of the realm was threatened by monarchical incapacity. It had never been used. Until now. William's reading of it was solemn. It made no mention of his father's name, only the phrases, "decline beyond discretion," and "crown strength must not stagger." Behind closed doors, William weighed the unspoken war between tradition and necessity. The classic investiture ceremonies, the grand swearing-in, the public, kneeling, the rehearsed pageantry were to be shelved. If the plan within the envelope succeeded, William would assume core responsibilities without ever formally being crowned. He would reign, in all but name, with one clear objective: keep the monarchy moving while its figurehead faded in the background. 3 weeks before the first rumours reached the public, Catherine was briefed. It was said she sat in silence for nearly an hour after hearing the full scope of the envelope's directives. Not out of fear, but the weight of inevitability. This wasn't a decision. It was destiny forced forward. And in private, William spoke the words, "No heir should ever have to voice so soon. It's sooner than I ever imagined." His aides, already experienced in managing diplomacy and crisis, moved to align logistics across key royal estates. Every correspondence now included a codename. Every briefing bore the seal of pre-coronation status. But William wasn't the only one preparing for the unthinkable. Behind palace walls, a woman the world thought they knew was quietly transforming into a sovereign force of her own. Gone were the floral dresses and polite smiles. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been summoned not as a consort but as a monarch in training. A secret draft entitled Lady Sovereign outlined her new operational authority in the event of a premature transition. And with every whispered meeting, she stepped deeper into a role she wasn't yet meant to fill but now couldn't afford to decline. The draft had been prepared in secrecy, authored by a coalition of senior palace advisors and constitutional guardians, loyal not to tradition, but to continuity. It bore the codename Lady Sovereign, and in its clauses, Catherine was formally named Operational Regent in Waiting, a designation so rare it hadn't been used since the Regency crisis of the early 19th century. The document did not grant her symbolic duties, it handed her power, layered, in language designed to bypass conventional coronation prerequisites. Catherine was now required to begin a full transition from public figure to private sovereign. Not by crown, not by throne, but by conduct. Within days, encrypted briefings were added to her daily schedule. Gone were the soft charity visits and curated photo calls. In their place, intelligence dossiers, national security updates, and emergency protocol rehearsals that rivaled those once given to Charles as Prince of Wales. Her briefings came directly from the Royal Advisory Council, who now viewed her not as the wife of the heir, but as the co-commander of a monarchy on the edge of a reshaping. Catherine began chairing internal review sessions, discreetly consulting with key cabinet liaisons and constitutional scholars to understand the balance of visibility and silence required for a regency that could be both real and unofficial. And it wasn't long before the optics began to shift. Staff at Buckingham, Sandringham, and Kensington received new operational directives. Whenever public engagements were coordinated, a dual framework was tested, Catherine flanking William not as a partner, but as a mirrored sovereign. In interviews, speech transcripts were tightened, her seating arrangements subtly altered. The public saw only grace. But within palace walls, a new order was being rehearsed in real time. She stood where monarchs stood. She spoke where queens spoke. And slowly, but without mistake, she stepped into the silhouette of the crown. Her internal struggle, however, remained unseen. Privately, she was devastated by Charles's decline. She had long held a deep respect for his journey, his battles for relevance, and his personal legacy as a father and sovereign. But heartbreak gave way to resolve. In a single meeting, following her second full classified intelligence briefing, she is said to have uttered words that haunted her aides. "If we falter, the monarchy fractures." From that point, her emotional restraint hardened into sovereign instinct. Yet the most searing moment came not in council chambers, but in a private confrontation with Queen Camilla. Sources inside Clarence House described an explosive exchange, Camilla allegedly accusing Catherine of overreach, suggesting the princess was being used to push Charles out prematurely. Catherine, holding the Lady Sovereign dossier in hand, responded not with defense, but with finality. "I didn't ask for this, but I won't let this institution break because no one else could bear the weight." The silence after those words was said to be deafening. Lines were drawn, not between public and private, but between old power and emergent reign. But just as Catherine embraced the shadows of sovereign duty, resistance emerged not from the public, but from within the very bloodline sworn to uphold her reign. Queen Camilla was never meant to be queen, yet she clawed her way there. And she wasn't about to be, sidelined by transition whispers or protocol drafts. As Catherine ascended in power and presence, Camilla launched a counter-offensive, invoking Charles's will, demanding visibility, and clashing behind closed doors with the woman the people were already calling queen. The stirrings of unrest began quietly, almost indistinguishably from routine. But inside Clarence House, Camilla was no longer content with silence. She demanded answers, legal, public, and symbolic. She questioned the constitutional grounds that allowed Catherine to receive briefings once reserved only for reigning monarchs or their regents. She challenged the legitimacy of Lady Sovereign, arguing it had never passed through full royal legal council review, and more than anything, she was furious, not just at the changing optics, but at the speed with which the crown's inner circle seemed to be erasing her influence from the grand picture. Behind closed doors, Camilla convened her own legal team, citing clauses, in Charles's living will that emphasized joint visibility and continued royal support in times of incapacitation. She insisted those lines entitled her to be more than a ceremonial placeholder. She was, in her view, the true crown adjunct. What followed next was nothing short of tactical obstruction. Leveraging her long-standing ties within the Duchy of Cornwall, Camilla discreetly disrupted transition funding approvals, stalling logistical movements tied to Catherine and William's visibility expansion. From scheduling conflicts to budget freezes, the Duchy's network slowed the Crown's operational rollout by weeks. While no one publicly acknowledged her involvement, insiders traced a pattern. Anything bearing Catherine's crest encountered sudden administrative delays. Simultaneously, Camilla made a bolder, more visible move. She dispatched a series of formal letters to Downing Street and senior Commonwealth leaders, requesting written clarity on the current regency structure. By invoking the phrase shadow coronation, she strategically framed William and Catherine's rise as a breach of sovereign trust, not a preparation for it. The tension reached a boiling point in a confrontation that shook even the most seasoned aides. William, scheduled for a closed-door family strategy session, was met with Camilla's direct challenge. With palace staff just beyond the panelled door, she accused him of orchestrating her political burial while her husband still lived. William, reportedly calm but resolute, refused to yield. Their conversation escalated into a power play, one side invoking duty, the other invoking survival. But it didn't end there. Camilla's final blow came with a whispered threat, one that spread through the palace like wildfire. If the transition continued without her blessing, she would release the contents of Prince Philip's final letter to Charles, a letter long rumoured to contain personal warnings about the future of the monarchy. No one knew if the letter even existed, but the threat alone sent a chill through the palace halls. Behind the scenes, internal palace communications shifted. In an internal memo circulated within the sovereign's private office, Camilla's name appeared beside a title never seen before: Legacy Guardian. It was a designation that carried no constitutional authority, but immense symbolic weight. It meant she saw herself as the protector of Charles's legacy, not just his wife, but the final voice defending his reign against premature erasure. But as the monarchy fractured within, the public's perception began to crystallize, and what they saw was not fear or instability, but the emergence of a new reign in waiting. As images of Catherine in somber navy leading Charles's public prayers went viral, a quiet coronation began not in Westminster, but in the hearts of the British people. Polls surged, headlines softened, and a fragile kingdom, grieving yet hopeful, began to look to her not as a wife or mother, but as their next sovereign. In the court of public opinion, Catherine had already stepped into the crown's silhouette. For weeks, the monarchy had teetered between secrecy and symbolism. but the people had decided long before Parliament ever dared speak. Her approval ratings eclipsed every living royal, even her husband, and by a margin that couldn't be ignored. The British public, wearied by decades of scandal and fragmentation, found in Catherine something they hadn't felt since Elizabeth II: steadiness, dignity, belief, a woman who didn't demand loyalty, but commanded it through presence alone. What began as speculation turned into a movement. Social media platforms lit up with a single phrase that pulsed with emotion and defiance. Catherine our Queen, not princess, not consort, Queen. The press, once hesitant to break from protocol, followed suit. What had previously been written with cautious deference, the Princess of Wales, was now being replaced with the future Queen. Tabloids shifted from gossip to reverence. Front pages were adorned with bold declarations: the monarchy's quiet power and a crown by public will. But no moment stirred the nation more than the video that surfaced from a children's hospice. In it, Catherine knelt beside a terminally ill girl, gently holding her hand as she whispered words of comfort. The girl, barely able to speak, looked up and called her, "My Queen." That clip, just 17 seconds long, shattered even the most hardened royal critics. It was replayed across every channel, dissected on talk shows, and embedded in the hearts of millions. For many, that was the moment the throne moved, not in law, but in legacy. Within the halls of power, the sentiment echoed louder than anyone had expected. Behind closed doors, Parliament began murmuring about the possibility of a soft transition. A phrase that, until recently, would have triggered constitutional alarms now found its way into draft memos and cross-party strategy discussions. It meant easing Catherine and William into full sovereign duties without officially triggering an abdication or a regency declaration. The machinery of state, once rigid with tradition, was now bending to public sentiment. And then came the call. The Prime Minister, after weeks of observing from the sidelines, formally requested a private meeting with William and Catherine. No public agenda was released, but insiders confirmed its purpose: to discuss transition optics, public morale, and contingency steps should Charles be deemed permanently unfit to reign. It was the first time a sitting Prime Minister had acknowledged, even implicitly, a shift in sovereign perception, not dictated by death or abdication, but by national will. But just as the future seemed to gain clarity, a document buried for decades would emerge, threatening to rewrite the very foundation of the royal line. Tucked away in a sealed vault under Windsor Castle was a parchment few even knew existed. The Sovereign Contingency Charter, drafted by Queen Elizabeth II in the twilight of her reign, outlined scenarios for accelerated transitions, forced abdications, and unprecedented regency permissions. And it named names including William and Catherine. Its discovery did not happen by accident. Amid the mounting pressure surrounding King Charles's health and the growing calls for clarity within the corridors of Parliament, a quiet directive was issued to the Royal Archives: search for any sealed constitutional provisions authorised post-2019. What archivists found stunned even the most seasoned advisors. The document, elegantly bound in black royal leather, was marked under the obscure designation Protocol Clarion. Inside lay Queen Elizabeth's final safeguard, her answer to a future she foresaw but never discussed aloud. It was not written in the language of sentiment or tradition. It was legal, it was binding, and it was devastating. The charter opened with a phrase no one expected: "In the event of sovereign incapacitation where clarity and continuity are threatened, the crown shall not wait." It was signed in her own hand, sealed with the monarch's insignia, and witnessed by her closest legal counsel. The contents outlined a structured mechanism for transition, one that didn't require the death or abdication of a reigning monarch. Instead, it introduced a radical framework called Early Stabilization of Crown, enabling the Prime Minister, the reigning monarch, and the Privy Council to trigger a provisional shift in executive authority. The crown would remain intact, but its center of power would shift, quietly, legally, swiftly. The legal council at Buckingham Palace erupted into internal conflict. Some viewed the charter as a sacred precaution, others called it a constitutional grenade. But for William, it was a map. It gave him not just justification, but instruction. With Charles unable to fulfill sovereign duties fully, William invoked the clause and formed the Transition Readiness Committee, a discreet task force operating under dual oversight from the Palace and Number 10. The committee's first act, to review all key functions currently held by Charles and determine how they could be reassigned under the Stabilization Clause without inciting public or legal backlash. It was a careful dance of legality and optics. The most damning revelation, however, was the Charter's explicit reference to bypassing a monarch deemed medically or psychologically unfit. It didn't accuse, it protected. Elizabeth had written not with criticism, but with contingency. She saw the monarchy not as a person, but as a structure. And structures, she knew, must never lean too far on one pillar, especially one that might fall. Within the text, William and Catherine were both named Crown Executors, a term never before used in royal history. It gave them conditional oversight on ceremonial, constitutional, and diplomatic matters, pending medical evaluation of the current monarch. This was no longer theory. It was protocol. The Charter's secrecy had once been its power. Now, it was its weapon. With Parliament looped in, the Privy Council consulted, and cabinet briefings underway, the Crown itself had entered a new phase. A phase not determined by tradition but by premeditated necessity. Elizabeth had prepared for this. The nation just hadn't known. As the machinery of the Crown churned into transition mode, one final question loomed. Was King Charles willing to let go, or would he fight to the end? The world had waited for weeks. Then, in a recorded address from Balmoral, King Charles finally spoke. But this wasn't a farewell. It was a reckoning. In a voice both proud and frail, he acknowledged his condition, his doubts, and his reluctant blessing for a reign that would begin before his ended. The Windsor Accord had been born, and with it, a nation held its breath. The statement was unlike anything the monarchy had ever sanctioned. No script was leaked, no media pre-briefed. It was raw, deliberate, and delivered not from a throne room, but from the solitude of Balmoral, a setting that itself spoke volumes. Charles confirmed what many had feared, and few had said aloud. His health was deteriorating, and while he would not step down, he could no longer serve in full command of the crown. There would be no abdication, no formal handover, but the function of monarchy would now be shared. For the first time in modern British history, the sovereign acknowledged that the burden of kingship was too heavy for one, and so he named William and Catherine as regency leaders in practice, a phrase carefully chosen to respect tradition while rewriting it entirely. The Windsor Accord, as it was instantly dubbed, was a constitutional novelty. It granted William and Catherine joint visibility across all ceremonial, diplomatic, and advisory domains, effectively making them monarchs in motion while Charles remained the legal sovereign. Though the crown would not be passed, its presence would now be divided, not weakened, but mirrored. In doing so, Charles attempted the impossible, preserving his reign without denying the future. But it was not just what he said it was who was absent that ignited a storm. Camilla, whose presence had once been central to the crown's image, was nowhere to be seen. Her name went unmentioned. Her chair beside him remained empty. That single omission sparked 1,000 interpretations. Had she refused to stand beside a weakened king, or had Charles made a silent decision to reposition the narrative without her? Palace aides refused to comment. But the silence, in its brutal clarity, spoke louder than any denial. Yet it was Charles's final words that struck the most profound chord with the public. The crown must outlive the man who holds it. It was an admission not of defeat, but of duty. And in that moment, for many, Charles became something more than a monarch. He became human. The reaction from the public was a mix of mourning and quiet admiration. Mourning for the man who had waited his entire life, only to find his reign shortened by forces beyond control. Admiration for the courage to relinquish part of that reign to those he trusted most. The accord brought a sense of clarity the nation hadn't known in months. Though the monarchy was fractured behind the scenes, to the public, a new era had begun. William and Catherine now stepped forward not merely with permission, but with blessing. The crown, once singular in its image, was now a shared light, a bridge between what was and what must be. But just as the nation began to accept a peaceful passage, a private act of devotion from William would shift everything and turn the story of transition into one of destiny. In the dead of night, without cameras or fanfare, Prince William entered the royal crypt beneath St. George's Chapel. Before the tomb of Queen Elizabeth II, he laid a single scroll and whispered a vow not even Catherine was told. That moment wasn't ceremonial, it was transformational. The Prince of Wales had left. The future king had emerged. No announcement preceded his visit, no advisors, no procession, just one man, walking alone into the most sacred space of the monarchy, carrying a document known only by its codename, Sovereign Pledge. According to the chapel registrar, William requested the crypt be opened under royal seal access, a rarely used request reserved for private acts of homage or personal rites. The scroll he carried was placed beside the Queen's tomb in silence. Its contents were never meant for public consumption. But as with all things royal, secrecy could only last so long. Within days, details began to leak from the walls of Windsor, whispered by those too moved to stay silent. The vow was brief, yet thunderous in its meaning. I will not wait for history, I will carry it. Those words marked not just a personal turning point, but a symbolic transfer of royal will. It was not defiance of his father's reign, it was the quiet, unshakable declaration that the crown would no longer be held in suspense. Sources close to the inner circle say Charles wept upon reading it, not out of resistance, but relief. For all the fractures that had emerged, for all the turmoil around Camilla, Clarion protocols, and regency dynamics, Charles saw in that vow the one thing that could save the monarchy. A son ready to lead, not by force, but by conviction. What followed was just as profound. Days after William's visit, Catherine made her own solitary journey. While her gesture was less documented, its symbolism spoke volumes. She left behind a ring, one not worn in public since the Queen's death. It had belonged to Elizabeth, worn often during her early years as sovereign, a silent emblem of resolve and restraint. Catherine's offering wasn't scripted, it was instinctual, a mark of unity, of shared purpose. She and William weren't just stepping forward together, they were binding themselves to the memory, discipline, and duty of the late Queen's legacy. Inside the palace, the impact of their midnight pilgrimages triggered immediate shifts. Operation Swan Rise, the final internal phase of transition preparation, was activated. Under this codename, the monarchy's most senior advisors convened to begin realigning communications, scheduling, and diplomatic protocols around a dual leadership model. The public would continue to see Charles, but from this point on, William and Catherine would carry the crown's momentum. There would be no announcement, no proclamation, but the levers had moved. The crypt visit became something more than symbolic. It was a signal to those inside the institution. The reign had spiritually passed, even if legally it had not. And so, with a king who would not abdicate, a queen not yet crowned, and a nation divided between past and future, all eyes turned to one date, one moment, one ceremonial pivot. There would be no coronation yet, no anointing oil, no scepter. But as William and Catherine stepped onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace with Prime Minister and Archbishop behind them, the message was clear. This was not a rehearsal. This was not preparation. This was reign. Reborn, not by law, but by necessity. The ceremony had no precedent. Titled The Blessing of Duty, it stood in stark contrast to the gilded traditions of monarchs past. There were no choirs, no crowns, and yet the gravity was undeniable. Before a sea of silent onlookers, the Prime Minister delivered words that would define a generation. In the spirit of continuity and the guidance of duty, we recognize their Royal Highnesses as custodians of the Crown's living presence. With that, the shift became official. not in legal parchment, but in public will. The world did not see a king and queen awaiting ascension. They saw a monarchy in motion, anchored in unity and tempered by sacrifice. As the ceremony unfolded, one figure was notably absent. Camilla, Queen Consort, was seen leaving for Ray Mill House just hours before the event. No statement was issued, no explanation offered, and for many, her silence confirmed what insiders had already whispered: her chapter in this unfolding transition had closed. Meanwhile, at Balmoral, Charles remained behind the scenes, watching from a window flanked by Princess Anne. Those present say the king was composed, though contemplative, witnessing a version of his reign he had not chosen, but could no longer deny. Anne, ever the stalwart, stayed at his side, not as a challenger to the moment, but as a quiet witness to history's turning. But it was Catherine who delivered the most defining words of the day. Standing firm beside William, her voice steady, to address the nation with remarkable grace and conviction. We lead, not as replacements, but as guardians of a legacy that is not ours, but one entrusted to us until the day the crown is whole again. Her declaration struck a deep chord. It was not a claim to power, it was a vow of stewardship, and in that single moment, the people who had long debated her role found their answer. She was not rising to reign, she was rising to protect it. In the final act of the day's ceremony, palace aides lowered the royal standard briefly, then raised it again, an ancient, silent symbol of continuity. Not a transfer of power, but of presence. A handover not written in law, but imprinted in hearts. The crowd outside the gates did not cheer. They stood in collective stillness, absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. The monarchy had not changed hands, but it had changed form. But even as William and Catherine take their place in history, the question remains, is the throne truly shared? Or will Charles's shadow still rule behind the veil? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.